Hello and welcome to Q&A. I'm Jay Nordlinger, and this podcast is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. I'll have more to say about them later on. I'm in Washington, D.C. in a hotel at a National Review Institute conference with Daniel Hannan, sitting right here with Dan Hannan, the British writer and member of the European Parliament. Last night he received an award from the National Review Institute, the first ever Whittaker Chambers Award. It was given to him for his role in Brexit, which is to say the exit by Britons from the European Union by referendum. And also I should mention that Dan is the editor-in-chief of a new periodical, a new quarterly. Is that right, Dan?
Correct.
In Europe, but of course readable all over, called The Conservative. So, Daniel Hannan, hello.
Hi, Jay. Lovely to see you again.
This is going to be a bit of a speed round. We'll do 15 minutes or so. So are you still in the European Parliament?
Until the day that Brexit takes effect, I'm still there. So probably for another couple of years.
And is there, forgive me if this is an insulting question, is there real work to do, or is the European Parliament more ceremonial, let's say?
There is real work to do. The relevance of that work to the United Kingdom is, of course, slightly diminishing because within a couple of years, a lot of the regulation that is currently being passed there will cease to apply to us, I'm glad to say. So the urgency of being there is less than it was, which is why I'm in Washington, D.C. rather than in Brussels this week.
I think in the American military they'd say you all are short-timers.
Yeah, and there is an element of that. I mean, look, the prosperity of the EU still matters to us, right? We have an interest in the well-being of our neighbours. We want wealthy neighbours so that they're good customers, and so we have some interest in it. But there is going to be a gradual reorientation now of Britain to the rest of the world.
So, Daniel, I'm going to give you a grand total of about a minute on this. I've been taught, if you will, to dislike the EU very much, the EU, SSR, and so on. And I, of course, was a Brexiteer. But I must say I go to smaller, weaker countries like the Baltic states, where they very much prize their membership of the EU. They hold it to be very important. And I feel like a churl if I say, no, you're wrong, and my friends on the American right and the British right are all correct.
We all have our own national circumstances and our own stories. Britain joined the EU at a very bad moment. The mid-'70s was our lowest moment as a country. We were pessimistic and depressed.
Sick man of Europe.
Quite. We had double-digit inflation, constant strikes, and that, of course, has changed, and we've now left in a more optimistic mood. Every country had its own reasons. You know, the Italians were sick of their own political class. The Germans were sick of the history of warfare. The Low Countries had been repeatedly drawn into Franco-German wars. The Baltics were looking for security. Every country has its own reasons, and so it's not for me to say which ones are valid or invalid. The only thing I would say is that during the referendum campaign, a decision was made in the UK and announced to deploy British servicemen to the defence of Estonia and Poland. Those soldiers have now started taking up their positions, riflemen and hussars, and no one criticised the decision. It was completely uncontroversial. It's very important to stress that leaving the European Union didn't mean and doesn't mean turning our backs on our allies.
Dan, this is a point you've heard before. It may be a little bit cute, but I'll repeat it. Many of my friends on the Leave side, the Brexit side, say Britain does not have sovereignty. We lack sovereignty. We're ruled by Brussels, so we want to be a sovereign country again. Does the fact that Britons voted themselves out of the EU prove that they were sovereign all along and that the EU was a voluntary association, the kind sovereign nations can form?
Well, that's a bit like saying that because we have the theoretical right to abolish the monarchy, we are a republic. I mean, until you actually do it, you're not sovereign. And
well put.
Sovereignty literally means that you are the ultimate authority. It isn't a loose synonym for power in the way that it's often used today. You know, a sovereign country can't do this. It means that ultimately you do not have a superior legal system able to strike down your own decisions. At the moment, we have. And when we leave the EU, we won't have.
Daniel, on the American right now, one of the great epithets is globalism and globalist. It's a great swear word. The Trump people say America first, nationalism. The bad guys are globalists. I noted the other day you spoke of Britain's great and historic global vocation.
Right.
Could you speak of this global vocation?
Yes. I think the mistake that people have made, not least in Brussels, is pursuing international relations as a government-led, top-down project. And the kind of globalization that I am comfortable with is a globalization that is organic, is unforced, is natural, and is based on links between businesses and individuals which are voluntary. And this is a world away from the globalization of international technocracies and UN rules and European Union-type regional blocs telling us all what to do. They fail for the reason that big government always fails. And instead, I would like to have freedom, free trade, and the voluntary association of peoples.
Daniel, do you have any time for nationalism, or are you patriotism all the way?
The words are so loose, but what I understand by nationalism, the national principle, is that democracy should happen within a unit where people feel a sufficient community of identity that they will accept each other's decisions. In other words, democracy works best within a nation. So I tend to be in favour of peoples being allowed to draw their own boundaries and rule themselves in peace with their neighbours. And if you look at where most of the conflicts are in the world today, picture in your head a map of the world and where are the flash points, in Kashmir, in Israel-Palestine, Chechnya, South Sudan, whatever. Almost always it's because a group of people feel that they're in the wrong country. Either that they have no loyalty to the state of that country, or that they're separated from sundered kindred somewhere else, from irredenti. So by and large, I think allowing people, this is, obviously populations are intermingled, this is not going to happen in a perfect way, but the closer you can get to natural ethnographic borders, to borders that reflect the wishes of the people who live there, the more likely you are to have peaceful neighbours.
I'm Jay Nordlinger. You're listening to Q&A. We're talking with the invaluable Daniel Hannan. Back in a minute.
Are you hiring? Do you know where to post your job to find the best candidates? Posting your job in one place isn't enough to find quality candidates. If you want to find the perfect hire, you need to post your job on all the top job sites, and now you can. With ZipRecruiter.com, you can post your job to 100-plus job sites, including social media networks like Facebook and Twitter, all with a single click. Find candidates in any city or industry nationwide. Just post once and watch your qualified candidates roll in to ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use interface. No juggling emails or calls to your office. Quickly screen candidates, rate them, and hire the right person fast. I happen not to be hiring at the moment, but if I were, I'd use ZipRecruiter. It takes away so much of the work. It makes the hiring process easier for employers and applicants alike. Find out today why ZipRecruiter has been used by Fortune 100 companies and thousands of small and medium-sized businesses. And right now, our listeners can post jobs on ZipRecruiter for free by going to ZipRecruiter.com/free trial. That's ZipRecruiter, one word, .com/free trial, also one word. One more time. To try this for free, go to ZipRecruiter.com/free trial.
Welcome back to Q&A. I'm Jay Nordlinger with the writer and member of the European Parliament, from Britain, of course, Daniel Hannan. Dan, a good number of our friends like Marine Le Pen in France, and they like Viktor Orbán in Hungary, and they like the so-called Freedom Party in Austria. Do you?
No. The first of those is a quite extreme socialist, as well as being.
Is she going to win, Dan?
I think it's unlikely, but what do I know, right?
We're speaking of Marine Le Pen.
Yeah. Speaking of Marine Le Pen,
her father's daughter.
She is well to the left of the French Socialist Party on economic policy. She wants tariffs, she wants workers controlling factories, she wants massive tax rises, and she mingles this socialism with an element of nationalism, and we've seen that before, and it's a fairly ugly cocktail. I don't think any Anglosphere conservative who admires her has properly grasped what it is she stands for. I don't think they can have looked very carefully. at her manifesto. And I would make, on a much gentler scale, some of the same criticisms of Viktor Orbán. He has become a strong man and authoritarian, but also someone who is prepared to intervene heavily in the economy in a way that no free marketeer would recognize as conservative. The FPÖ obviously is a slightly different fish. It began as a liberal party, was then taken over by Haider in the 1980s. But I think, again, it has an element to its ideology where not everyone would be equally treated before the law. And that, I think, is an affront to the basic values of the English-speaking democracies.
Are we speaking of Hungary now or Austria?
Of Austria.
Right.
Austria, yeah. I mean,
is the Freedom Party misnamed in your judgment?
I mean, look...
They've entered into a friendship agreement with Putin's Kremlin.
Right, and there are... I mean...
And so is the Northern League in Italy.
Right. There is a lot of this Putinite activity in Europe. They fund a lot of political activity through, sometimes officially, sometimes in a hidden way. Austria is a cartel democracy. It was run by two parties in a kind of clinched together like exhausted boxers in a ring, propping each other up, the Socialists and the People's Party. And so some decent people drifted to the Freedom Party just as an alternative. But that should not blind us to the huge ideological differences between them and a mainstream conservative in Britain or America. Nor should it blind us to the extent of Putinite influence across the whole continent, from France to Bulgaria, where they are actively stirring things up with a view to weakening the resolve of the West.
So Putin gives a press conference once a year around Christmas. And he was told by someone how popular he was among Republicans, with a big R, in the United States. And he says here, it's good that there are people who sympathize with our views on traditional values, he said. What do you make of that?
I think Putin is trying to set himself up as the anti-Western poster boy. He has become the champion for everybody who is hostile to the liberal democratic traditions of the English-speaking peoples. So everyone who thinks that we are too soft on homosexuality, or too obsessed with capitalism and materialism and money, or have too many Jews, or have too lax a morality. Again, we've seen these sentiments before, and in their expression traditionally they have been extremely ugly and destructive. I can only assume that Western, and particularly American admirers of this guy haven't really grasped what it is he's saying. He's fundamentally hostile to the whole basis on which we organize a pluralist, open society.
Let's end on this, Daniel. I've been quoting this lately. It's something that Radek Sikorski said recently. First on this, he reminded me talking about Marine Le Pen. He says something like this. This is a paraphrase. I don't mean to hold him to this. He says something like, it's a shame that the term National Socialism has been taken, so to speak, that it's been so stigmatized, because it really is the phase juste, if you will, for some of these movements. But we can't really use it because they're not Nazis.
No.
At least not yet. But it's sort of applicable, National Socialism. And what he says is, this will be the last word, is the combination of statism, if you will, and, for lack of a better expression, right-wing politics, right-wing cultural policy, and so on, a right-wing attitude. That combination, which is, of course, old and smelly, is just about the most potent electoral force on earth. It is a vote-getter all the way.
Yes, I'm not sure I would call it right-wing. I think this combination of nationalism and socialism is just as apt a description of, say, the politics of Hugo Chavez as of Marine Le Pen.
Yeah.
It was the classic anti-colonial position of the Nassers and so on, that you were nationalist and anti-capitalist because your nationalism took the form of wanting national ownership and driving out foreign businesses and so on. So it's not something that only, as it were, refers to 1930s Germany. It's not been a potent force in the English-speaking world until now, and I don't think that's going to change. We've not elected anywhere in the Anglosphere a single fascist MP ever. We've elected the tiniest number of communists. We have a concern for individual liberty historically, which is, I think, unique and serves as something of an inoculation. But I think it is, in a much more moderate form, I'd allow this much. A mildly authoritarian politics, which would be somewhere in British terms between kind of traditional patriotic Labour and working class Tory. In other words, a slightly statist politics that is for high state spending, for a much tougher policy on immigration, that is for family values, is mildly anti-gay, that is patriotic. I think that is, I mean, it's a long way from my cup of tea, but it is probably the most underrepresented position in our legislatures. The mismatch between the number of people who would vote for that and the number of parliamentarians who represent it is significant.
This is the final word, so to speak. You mentioned Hugo Chavez, and that got me to thinking about South America and your upbringing in Peru. Is there some streak of you? Do you feel a tiny bit South American, or some sort of affinity? And I know you're as British as the Queen, maybe more so, but you know what I mean.
I've lived in lots of countries, and it gives you perspective. I love South America. I have friends in Peru, and I like the cuisine, I like the music, and I can get very sentimental about all of that. But I think it's quite important to know that you belong somewhere. And in Brussels, I came across a lot of people who never had that. They never had a place that they called home. And in fact, if you asked them where they were from, it was considered almost a microaggression. You know, we're all Europeans now. What do you mean, where am I from? You know, and I mean, I would put it like this. I'd quote a generally rather a man I rather disapprove of, but it was a very useful way of putting it. Woodrow Wilson talked about the South being the only place where nobody ever needs to explain anything to me. And I think that's a great concept. I think we should all have somewhere where nobody ever needs to explain anything to us. Britain, for me, is that place.
I guess for me, it's Washtenaw County, Michigan. I'm Jay Nordlinger for Q&A. We've been listening to Daniel Hannan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and later.
Ricochet. Join the conversation. Join the conversation. Join the conversation. Join the conversation. Join the conversation.